Hi, this is Jeff Hastings. Welcome to Chapter 6, Conditioning and Learning. After you read this chapter, you should be able to define learning, outline the 4 types of learning, define associative learning and identify 2 types of associative learning, explain how classical conditioning works, explain how operant conditioning works, including how positive and negative reinforcement and punishment will impact the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated, define cognitive learning, outline the 2 main dimensions of Bloom's taxonomy, describe 4 factors that affect cognitive learning, name 4 strategies that can help you change bad habits, and create a plan to change your own behavior. Let's watch a quick video that outlines and gives a great summary for Chapter 6.
Welcome, students, to this video summary of Chapter 6 from your textbook, Introduction to Psychology, Gateways to Mind and Behavior, and brought to you by your Professor, Jeffrey Hastings. Today, we embark on a captivating exploration of the multifaceted realm of learning. In this chapter, we will delve into the intricate processes that underpin learning, unraveling its profound impact on human behavior, cognition, and development. Join us as we navigate through the diverse theories and mechanisms of learning, seeking to comprehend the fundamental principles that govern how we acquire new knowledge, skills, and behaviors. In this brief summary, we will uncover the mechanisms of classical and operant conditioning, explore the complexities of observational learning, and examine the interplay of nature and nurture in shaping our learning experiences. Through this investigation, we will gain a deeper understanding of how our experiences and interactions with the environment sculpt our thoughts, actions, and perceptions. Have you ever felt, while some things come easily, other times it is difficult to learn something new or understand a lecture given in class? Perhaps you have a difficult time understanding complex math problems, writing a paper, or learning a new language. Don't worry, you are not alone. In fact, most people experience these challenges, but only a small handful take the time to understand how they learn, and more importantly, how to improve. Let's unravel this mystery together. Learning at its core requires attention and focus. When you are good at something, it's most likely due to the fact you enjoy the activity and have spent a significant time developing your skill. Likewise, if you are uninterested or spend little time learning something new, the chances are that the new knowledge you obtain will not last. There are 4 primary ways in which we learn. The first is through association, where we link 2 things together. The second is non-associative, where our response to a stimulus changes over time. The third is observational, where we learn by watching others. And finally, there is cognitive, where we intentionally focus to gain knowledge through thoughts, thinking, and senses. Understanding our own unique learning styles and changing the way we absorb information is the key ingredient to understanding, retaining, and recalling knowledge when needed. If we were to compare our brain to a personal computer, its memory capacity would be equivalent to an astonishing 2.5 petabytes of storage. To offer some context, it's estimated that the brain storage capacity is roughly equivalent to 3 million hours of TV film. This remarkable capacity highlights the immense power inherent in our brains. However, it is our responsibility to effectively harness and maximize this extraordinary resource to its utmost potential. Unpacking associative learning, we find 2 intriguing forms: classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, think Pavlov's dog, links 2 stimuli to anticipate events, while operant conditioning, like Skinner's pigeons, connects behavior and consequence to shape action. Extinction occurs when the association fades, but sometimes there's spontaneous recovery. Stimulus generalization and discrimination, they're about how we respond to similar stimuli or differentiate between them. Through these mechanisms, we form associations that guide our behaviors and decisions. But what about learning that isn't just about association? Enter cognitive learning. Cognitive learning, unlike associative learning, is about understanding, processing, and applying information. It's not just psychologists who are interested in cognitive learning. Cognitive scientists too find it intriguing. Now let's take a look at Bloom's taxonomy, a framework that outlines two main dimensions of cognitive learning. On one hand, we have the cognitive process dimension, which involves remembering, understanding, applying, analysing, evaluating, and creating. On the other hand, we have the knowledge dimension, which ranges from factual knowledge to metacognitive knowledge. But what factors affect cognitive learning? Well, there's motivation, practice, feedback, and the learning environment. For instance, a motivated learner with regular practice and constructive feedback in a conducive environment is likely to learn effectively. So, cognitive learning goes beyond mere association. It involves understanding, processing, and applying information. Having journeyed through the intricacies of learning, let's take a moment to recap our enlightening exploration.
So let's get right into the basics of learning. So how do we learn? There are four prominent learning styles: visual, auditory, read and write learning, and kinesthetic. While most of us have some general idea of how we learn, not all of us really understand how we're processing that information. So first off, you may want to learn this definition of learning. It is defined as any relatively permanent change in behavior that can be attributed to experience. That is the definition of learning, and is probably on your test, something that you would want to remember. But understanding how you learn can make a dramatic impact on the success of school, work, and your life. Understanding how you learn is important because as you're studying, for this quiz, or you're trying to remember information in another course or at work or whatever the case may be, knowing how you learn could be critical to your success on how you design your study. So if you're more of an auditory learner, which most people are, and without even realizing it, it's best to not even look at the visual, even on this video, but to have an audio recording of all the information that's being presented. And matter of fact, we'll test that coming up next week when we get into a little bit more about intelligence, but also more about some of these learning styles that I will provide for you an auditory quiz study guide, where all you can do is listen to my voice, listen to the different definitions and the information for the quiz, and learn that way. And you may find out that you retain that information a lot better. And if you do find that out now, think about how that's going to help you in the future as you're preparing for additional tests. Because if you have an iPhone or any type of cell phone or device that you can record, it is great to just take all your notes, take the important stuff you know that you need to learn, quickly read them into a recorder, and then listen to them when you're in the car driving around, or when you're in bed preparing to go to sleep, or even turning on your headphones. You would be surprised on how much information you learn. So it is good to know what type of learner you are. So as far as the different types of learning, one of those types is called associative learning, and it's a simple association between stimuli. So in your environment, if you think about all these different senses that we're experiencing, from sight and sound and everything, we take that and we can take that information in. And associative learning means that we associate a certain stimuli with a behavior or response, our body, whether it be physiological response, to be that a dog wags their tail, they start salivating for preparation of food, or whatever the case. They associate a certain thing that automatically creates this. It ends up being a trained behavior or response to that stimuli. So there are two different types of associative learning. And also realize with associative learning, you really aren't having to, it doesn't require a lot of your attention. These things can be learned without your attention and without even knowing it in many cases, that you just associate certain things with a different response. And there's two different types of that. Associated, again, is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, like it was mentioned in the video, is something like Pavlov's dog, where there starts with a untrained stimulus, and that's the sound of a bell that you're going to learn about here in a moment. We'll watch a quick video on that as well, where if a dog hears a bell, or we hear a bell or whatever, you really don't think much about it. But if that bell ends up leading to, over and over, let's say the offer of food or a treat to a dog, an animal, they will start associating the bell with the food. And when that happens, this what was an unconditioned response would be salivation becomes conditioned, where the bell automatically creates salivation even without that food being offered. So that's between a unconditioned becomes a conditioned stimulus to a conditioned response. And that's classical conditioning. Where operant conditioning is different, it's very similar, but it's called trial and error learning as well. But it is associative learning. But what it happens is the behavior is strengthened or weakened depending on the consequences. But where there could be a reward like a treat, but there's also can be a consequence, a negative thing could happen. And we'll talk a little bit about operant conditioning. So instead of the bell ring would say, instead of just the dog getting the treat every time, it may be the bell rings and the dog, if the dog does what he's supposed to do, they get a treat. But if they don't do what they're supposed to do, let's say we're training a bell with sitting and they're not sitting, whenever they do sit, they get a treat. But if they don't sit, let's say that there's a negative consequence, and we'll talk about that. So that's more of operant conditioning when there's an if or then statement kind of on there. So on the test, what are two types of associative learning? Hopefully you know that now. It's either classical or operant conditioning. And if the test, you do get a question that asks for an example of a simple association between various stimuli and or behaviors that don't require much effort, the answer would be associative learning, because neither one of those require a lot of effort. So we'll get into classical conditioning and how it works. And so, it's a form of learning, again, in which a reflex response, the reflex response or reflux even are associated with a new stimuli. That means it is a trained stimuli, becomes trained. So it first is neutral and it has an unconditioned stimulus. So the neutral stimulus could be a bell, the unconditioned stimulus, they get the food, but when it becomes stimulus, then that trained stimulus response would be the salivation. So we'll go over that here in a moment. An unconditioned stimulus elicits a response without prior experience. An unconditioned response is a response to a stimulus without previous experience. But then we have a neutral stimulus, does not produce a specific response like the bell. But when it becomes conditioned stimulus, that neutral stimulus, the bell, through pairing with an unconditioned stimulus, comes to an elicit learned response, which becomes a conditioned stimulus. So just know that. So in the test, we may ask you in a classical conditioning experiment, what is a neutral stimulus? You need to know that that does not produce a specific response if it's neutral. And also, what must be paired together for classical conditioning to occur, and what has to be paired together would be a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned response. Once they're paired together in classical conditioning, that's whenever the magic happens. So just something you have to be aware of there. Conditioned response, that is when it's a learned reaction by pairing after it has been paired, after the fact. Once it's been paired, the bell rings with or without food, it is going to create that salivation. That becomes a conditioned response. So it's learned reaction by pairing an original neutral stimulus with an unconditioned response stimulus. That becomes a conditioned response. So let's watch a quick video.
Have you ever wondered why your heart races when you see a spider, even if it's just a harmless house spider, or why you salivate at the smell of your favorite food? These reactions might seem automatic, but they're actually the result of something called classical conditioning. Now imagine a different scenario. You're at work, and whenever you complete a project ahead of schedule, your boss gives you a bonus. Over time, you start finishing all your tasks early in anticipation of that extra cash. This is a different form of learning known as operant conditioning. To understand these concepts better, let's visualize them with a couple of stories. Picture a young boy named Timmy who loves to play in his grandmother's garden. One day, while playing, a bee stings him. It's a painful experience, and he develops a fear of bees. Over time, this fear extends to anything that buzzes around him, including harmless flies. This is a classic example of classical conditioning. The buzzing noise, which was initially neutral, now triggers fear in Timmy because he associates it with the painful bee sting. Now consider another story. Imagine a dog named Rex. Every time Rex sits on command, his owner gives him a treat.
Rex begins to understand that sitting when told equals getting a tasty reward, so he starts sitting every time his owner commands him to.
So I want to make a point there real quick that on a when what we're talking about with operant conditioning, it may say something about Pavlov's dog here, but this is the dog has to sit before offering a treat. That's the difference between just classical conditioning and operant. Operant, the dog has to do something before they get the reward. Where if it was just classical, they're going to get the treat every single time the bell rings. So I just wanted to make that point here quickly.
This is an example of operant conditioning. Rex learns to associate his behavior of sitting on command with the positive outcome of receiving the treat. So, what sets classical and operant conditioning apart? Well, classical conditioning involves associating an involuntary response from a stimulus, while operant conditioning is about associating a voluntary behavior and a consequence. In classical conditioning, like in Timmy's case, the response is automatic. His fear response to buzzing insects wasn't something he consciously controlled, but in operant conditioning, like with our friend Rex, the behavior is voluntary. Rex chooses to sit on command because he knows he'll get a reward. Despite these differences, both types of conditioning play a crucial role in how we learn. They both involve making associations. In classical conditioning, we associate two stimuli to create a new reflexive response. And in operant conditioning, we associate a behavior with a consequence. Both classical and operant conditioning are central to our understanding of how humans and animals learn. They help us understand why we react the way we do to certain stimuli, and how we can modify behavior through rewards or punishment. So next time your heart races at the sight of a spider, or you find yourself working faster for that potential bonus, take a moment to appreciate the incredible learning processes at work. It's these processes that help us adapt to our environment and ultimately survive and thrive.
So do you see how this is important? It's kind of amazing. Sorry. That what this is doing is not just understanding conditioning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning. It's much deeper than that. When we get into psychology, I mean, think about even the example they used at the very end of that video presentation was the next time you think about getting that bonus at work, realize the complexity of how this classical conditioning or operant conditioning at work. So if you're ever managing people, or you're working, you're a parent with children, you're in a relationship with your partner, you're in a relationship with just a friend, this is about understanding human behavior. It's not just animal behavior. This is human behavior and why we do what we do. Whether we realize it or not, our body, our reactions are kind of put on autopilot, where we are responding as we take in all these senses, and we learned about senses and sensation. We take in that information, our brain deciphers that code, that information, and then we have a certain response to what that was. So whether we realize it or not, when certain things happen, we are going to react in a certain way. Sometimes those reactions are good and sometimes they're bad. Sometimes it's very easy to tell. I know whenever matter of fact, I was at Home Depot a few weeks ago, and I was bending over and someone had brought their dog in Home Depot, which happened to be a German Shepherd, and I was attacked by a German Shepherd whenever I was 4. So I'm deathly scared still to this day of German Shepherds. I see one, and especially not expecting it, the dog came behind me and sniffed my ear. You talk about almost passed out in the aisle at Home Depot. But that is classical conditioning. So there are some things like that. But what about when it's not so apparent, when you can't really pinpoint why you're reacting a certain way? When someone makes a comment to you that when they're making a statement and criticizing you for something, and you have this negative response and you don't realize why, by understanding how this works and through really stepping out of yourself and evaluating that, you may realize that possibly you were treated a certain way, maybe as a child, and that is creating this negative reaction that you didn't even realize, or another relationship, someone treated you a certain way and it was not a great thing. So you have this negative reaction that is affecting you today. So that's one real important thing to understand about how we not only learn, but why we do the things we do. The other thing is, if you're managing people and you want people to be more productive at work, understanding how this classical and operant, specifically in that case, operant, that if they do certain things, they can be rewarded. Understanding human behavior in that regard, then you can set up promotions and certain things that will pay off rewards or have consequences for acceptable work behavior. So now you're really understanding human motivation. And if you need your sales to perform, you're not thinking, okay, well, what do I do now? I mean, how do I get them to sell more products or provide a better service? With the understanding of this basic framework of our conditioning, our learned responses, that we can use it to our advantage to get people to step up, to be better, and understand truly what that incentive, how that can affect behavior and human and performance at work. So with this knowledge check activity, using Pavlov's experiment that you just learned, match the stimuli with the type of response. So when you look at what is a neutral stimulus, you know what the neutral probably is, right? At first, when it's not trained, it's the bell. But also realize once it's trained, that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. So it is kind of a little bit, not necessarily a trick question, just understand that that's how it works. And let's go ahead and look at what the answers are. So the neutral stimulus is a bell. The unconditioned stimulus, or UCS, is food. That's unconditioned at the beginning. And then we have an unconditioned response, could be salivation, because it's not conditioned at one point. But once it's conditioned, the conditioned stimulus, once that dog has gone through this over and over, consistently providing a treat or food, when they hear the bell, then that conditioned stimulus is a bell. And then the conditioned response is the salivation. So see how that works, that through association, associative learning, we skip the unconditioned stimulus. Once it's conditioned, now it's the bell to salivation with or without the food. Now, what we'll learn here in a minute, if we're not consistent by giving food, then it can weaken this conditioned response, maybe even eliminate it. But there's some other things that can happen along the way that are very interesting. We'll learn about here in a minute. And that's what actually is called extinction in conditioning, is if you're not consistent, and think about this, not with just a dog, but if you're trying to get your dog to sit or lie down or not scratch at the door when someone's barking, and you're needing to know how this works. But it also works, of course, in human behavior, is if you're a parent and you're trying to teach your child to do something, and once you teach it and you do get the optimal result because you're providing a reward or praise or whatever that case may be, it needs to be very consistent. But if you forget about doing it, or if you're not very consistent, that's okay. Matter of fact, variable rewards are very, very effective, actually even better, because if it's just they're getting it every single time, then they're going to expect it as soon as it's gone, it's going to weak or eliminate. Variable response actually gives the best result, believe it or not. But extinction and conditioning, you just need to know that means that if for a while you no longer offer that treat, then they can actually, that conditioned response can go away. It's not forever, is the main point there. And then, so we've got extinction, and that's what that means, that the connection becomes unconditioned. And then we have a spontaneous recovery, return of a learned response after apparent extinction. It can just pop up, and it's really kind of crazy, but it does happen. And you need to realize that there's also a definition of response contingent. I just wanted to put in there because there are some questions that may kind of float around to some of you on response contingent. It just means that the reinforcement is provided only after the subject has appropriate reaction to a stimulus. That's with condition. Remember, that's conditioned. You've got conditioned, but also contingent, and that is where it's the response is contingent. And like the bell rings and you instruct your dog to sit, that's going to be the contingent, but it's operant. It's more operant conditioning is what that's considered. Then we have stimulus generalization. It's when the response has been associated with one stimulus, like the bell, but it occurs after another stimulus that's very similar. Maybe it's not a bell, but let's say it was a siren or something, and your dog just freaks out, like, I'm going to get a treat, and that's kind of a strange example, but that's what stimulus generalization. It's like talked about when they had the experiment with the baby that they scared every time they saw a white rabbit, ended up being anything white and fluffy, created that that conditional response of the baby crying, in that one example in, I think, lesson 1 that we talked about very briefly. And then we have a discrimination or discriminative stimulus tells a person what behavior is going to get reinforced. It signals the availability of a particular reinforcement for a particular behavior. So it means I will give the dog a treat for if the bell rings once, but if the bell rings twice, you're going to do something like give the animal a lot of love and attention. So they start discriminating. It's a bell, but it may be a slightly different, and they can discriminate whether it's 1 ring or 2 rings of that bell. And that's where that comes into play. So when you talk about stimulus generalization, again, it's just basically it's the tendency to respond to stimuli similar to a conditioned stimulus, but it's not the same. That's what generalization means. Now, when we go to classical conditioning in everyday life, a conditional taste for food aversion, just let you know, that can occur when eating is followed by getting sick. So in other words, food aversion, if you ate like a pizza with anchovies, but the anchovies were bad, you may have this very bad response to anchovies in the future. So you may avoid it, or sushi or something like that. There's also unconditioned stimulus, like let's say it's a celebrity and you like a basketball player, and back in my day it was Michael Jordan, and you may like him, but then when they endorse a brand, then that brand becomes a conditioned stimulus. So if you're familiar with the story of Nike, and they created, of course, they're still very popular today, Air Jordans, where Nike was not the leader back then, was Adidas, and Nike, because of this, they used a conditioned stimulus type of motivation by getting people to associate a couple of things. First thing is the swish became a just do it, meaning it's a symbol of success and accomplishment. And that became a personal achievement, accomplishment, things like that, but also with relating and linking the Nike brand to Air Jordan, people would buy the shoes. And that's how it works in business, where, whether you realize it or not, especially social media, constant people are psychologists and other people trying to get you to respond in a certain way that they will create, and these advertising agencies will use psychological theories to get you to really respond in a certain way to their product, or it could be, or maybe it could be, especially when we get into politics, negative against someone else, because they associate these positive and negative circumstances and situations with a person. And that is what's called a conditioned emotional response. So they want to create that positive or negative emotional response. So if you think about like what's going on right now, and you think about the big fence with keeping everyone from Mexico that are not here legally out, that can create, whether you're for that or against it, it creates this emotional response. So if they know that, and they know where you kind of what your belief is, then they advertise, and they can advertise and try to relate this really good thing or bad thing with either their candidate or the other candidate. So that's a big part of conditioned emotional response theory. But there's also, let's see at the bottom of the slide, that aversion theory that was really common in the 1920s. It was called also aversive conditioning or counter conditioning, and it's type of behavioral therapy that used to be used where it's a treatment, a psychological treatment. It pairs a negative behavior with a bad habit, or with that negative behavior habit with a negative stimulus. And it's called ECT, electroconvulsive therapy is one of them, where whenever and it's with strict supervision, but they treat like severe negative behavior with actually shock therapy, believe it or not. Some still teach that type of, maybe more of a self-reinforcement aversion therapy, like putting a rubber band on your wrist. Every time you have this negative thought or behavior, they encourage you to pop a rubber band on your wrist. You may have heard that. And it's trying to associate this negative pain with this negative thought or behavior that you're doing. And it's kind of what's called self-reinforcement aversion. That statistically has not been proven to work. Matter of fact, it's actually even known in some cases that shock therapy and these electroconvulsive therapy or whatever has in some cases made it worse, or created additional problems, and really emphasized that negative behavior. And then it created guilt and shame and other kind of things. And, in 1961, I think a lot of people started looking at it when, if you know Ernest Hemingway, the writer, he actually went through ECT therapy, and he shortly after committed suicide. So, and they thought that, he had made comments that it just really brought to light these negative things and thoughts in his life. And that's when people started looking at that therapy from a different light. So, and it's still some of the way it's being used today, and the reason I'm bringing it up, that, maybe putting, like, if someone bites their nails, there's some kind of thing you can put underneath the nails to give it a bad taste, and that's been known to kind of help. But in some cases too, when people are smoking, they may have this light electronic shock that could happen, and it could relate to a negative thing, and they can stop smoking, possible, but it's still very controversial. So developing, a strong fear of, being in like a small place after getting stuck in an elevator. Think about that for a moment. For 5 hours, that's an example that demonstrates a conditioned emotional response. So if you start thinking, if someone, a psychiatrist or someone, walked you through this, to start picturing you being in a small place, getting stuck in an elevator for 5 places, that's going to create this negative conditioned emotional response that you may have had. And there are ways to prevent that. So we'll talk about those here in a moment, on how to retrain your brain and how it's reacting to these certain situations. So just a quick knowledge check. A phobia is a fear that persists even when no realistic danger exists. Which type of classical conditioning likely creates phobias? If you can think about that. And of course, that's easy. We just talked about a conditioned emotional response. So operant conditioning. Let's go to operant now. So we talked about classical, that there's associative learning, 2 types, classical and now operant. And we're going to talk about the operant conditioning. We've already talked about generalization, discrimination. Now we're going to talk about, with operant, into shaping. So shaping is a use of discrimination to learn more complicated behaviors. Remember the dog, instead of just giving them a treat and then they salivate to get the food, it's if they do something, if they sit, if they, or if someone does something, a child has a great behavior after a certain event happens, that we're trying to intentionally shape this behavior. But the key to it, when we get into operant conditioning, is that person or that animal has to consciously do something for that reward. And if they don't, then there could be a negative consequence also. So that is what's called as shaping. So, in conditioning, the reinforcement of increasingly close approximations of the desired response is a principle of shaping. So that's one thing to know. That could be on your test, but it just says in conditioning, it's that reinforcement of increasingly close approximations. So if we know what that desired response, that it's very systematic, and we're gonna show that is that one thing. When that dog sat, the reward, and that's what ends up happening, and that's called shaping. Which of the following best describes stimulus discrimination? And on that question, if you happen to get it, the answer is responding when rewarding stimuli are present and not responding when they're not present. That describes stimulus discrimination. So operant conditioning, again, it's associative learning based on positive or negative consequences of responding. But then we talk about Thorndike's law of effect. We're not going to get into that too much, but it basically states that behavior is followed by a reward or reinforcement. It's more about reinforcement, are likely in the future. So everything about Thorndike, he just wanted to, what ended up prove, and there were some other controversial things on that too, as with most of these theories. But Thorndike, it just proved that you want to associate that with reward or reinforcement. If there's reinforcement, the behavior is more likely to be repeated, whereas behaviors followed by a punishment are less likely. And that's what you want, right? If you punish, less likely to do it. If you reward, more likely. Kind of common sense, right? But it's not always the case, and it's not that simple. But it's a basic principle. It's a foundation for many of the ideas and techniques and behavioral perspective, with really educational psychology. So that's why it's very important. So it's Thorndike's law of effect. So when you think of Thorndike, think about reward and punishments. And think also about the word reinforcement that is important. Here's just a chart real quick of the difference between classical and operant conditioning. Just look at it. It's in your slides, your handouts. But just realize that classical conditioning, it focuses again on involuntary reflexive responses, whereas operant conditioning, it focuses on voluntary. So they're voluntarily doing something, a behavior, an action, and it's goal-directed behaviors. That's the difference. They're both associative learning, both take little effort, but operant is there is an expectation for that subject, that person or animal, to voluntarily show that desired behavior. So in there, there's some different things to, just realize too that we're looking at classical, think of Pavlov's dog, operant. You're going to learn here in a minute about Skinner's box, and his pigeons is what was actually said. There's two different big things that B.F. Skinner really talked about, or he was credited for. When he was a graduate student at Harvard, he created Skinner's box and very weird stuff. We'll go over it here in a minute, but he had two daughters, and very controversial on how he kind of treated those daughters, very much like a experiment, caused a lot of different conflict, but we'll get into that in a minute. But then we've got, so Skinner's box is operant, classical conditioning is more Pavlov's dog, where it just is the involuntary reflex, where operant is that reward or punishment could focus in there. So here's operant conditioning, and this is a Skinner box. The first one was a mouse that he created. This is what he did when he was at Harvard as a graduate student, when he created this and reported on it. And, Skinner, just to let you know, time frame 1904, he died in 1990. And conditioning through reinforcement or punishment. So this little mouse, picture the mouse in that box right there, and there's a lever. And of course, this built on Pavlov's dog. So Pavlov talked about conditioned response theory, but what he wanted to talk about, another part of associative learning, to say, listen, it's not just can we, every time that light turns on, the mouse would click a lever or whatever and get the reward, but he added to it with the Skinner box that wanted to test what is more motivating. Is it going to be the reward of the treat, or is it going to be punishment? And the punishment actually was shocking the crap out of this mouse. If the mouse did not respond the right way, they get shocked, and they quickly learn they better get the reward. And so, but what they found was and what he talked about was that treat, he concluded that was more powerful than the negative consequence or that response cost. It's the negative punishment or that shock. So that's what he theorized then. And so the results that just to know on the Skinner's box, or if you hear about B.F. Skinner, that the animals reacted better to reward than they did for punishment. But his findings also showed that positive behavior is reinforced better than negative reinforcement. So just to know that criticism really says he overemphasizes, the focus on behavior. And a lot of critics say that the focus entirely on observable behaviors. And that's okay with an animal, but when it comes to a person, a human, there are a lot of mental processes, thoughts, and feelings that really come into play when we are responding to these negative events, whether it's a reward or a punishment. And it's very complex. Human behavior is complex and can't be answered with a basic, is it reward or punishment type of thing. You can't be so clear cut. And matter of fact, a lot of people disliked him so much, they made up these kind of rumors, and it wasn't exactly true, but I think with every single negative rumor, there's probably some truth to it. But he had two daughters, and they said his daughter, Deborah and Julie, I think, but Deborah, the older one, there were rumors that she actually committed suicide, and they called her the baby in a box. There was a book that came out, I forgot when it was, but that said that Skinner, while at Harvard, and he went to, I think, University of Pennsylvania, and then came back over to Harvard, and he taught there the rest of his life before he died. And they said that his daughter he treated them like rats in a box or by experimental subjects, and said that his daughter committed suicide, and it wasn't true. She didn't. However, he did treat them in a weird way where he did a lot of experiments with his daughters, and they're still very controversial today on his punishment. But but here's one thing he did say, and I thought was very interesting, because it does kind of describe, when you're talking about negative behavior, does negative behavior generate or negative response or response cost, does that cure someone of doing the bad thing or having this bad behavior? He said if that were true, then criminals would go to jail, they would spend time in jail, realize what they did wrong, and they would never commit it again. But yet most prisoners, most people that were caught once, they end up going back to crime. So, and he said it was more that reward for it. Whatever it got them was more motivating to them, and they committed that more than that was worth more of the cost than that negative possibility of going back to prison. So he used that as an example, and that's when he did when he said that, it made sense, but he got a lot of criticism, because they're saying now you're really looking at a complex human brain. There are other things. There's also, do they have any other skills? Was it they stole something because they needed to eat? I mean, whatever the case may be, it's just they said that his theory, although its on the basis very good and we learned from it, it's not good enough for psychology and human behavior. So reinforcement and punishment, again, just to know on the test what a reinforcer is, and also know that, when is punishment is effective, but it's only effective when it's applied immediately after that undesired behavior occurs. If there's any time delay, the longer that time delay, then the less effective punishment would be, especially with an animal. They don't know if they crapped in the house and you find it 3 hours later and you spank them, that's what the spanking was for. They have no way to conceptualize that. Some people rub their nose in it, and it just becomes kind of cruel. But just try to catch them, let your dog out when they're supposed to go out, and reward them for doing their business outside instead of just that negative behavior. It's better to reward the good behavior than try to punish for that bad behavior. But also, another way that best describes what positive reinforcement is, presenting a pleasant consequence or a reward immediately following that response. That's what a positive reinforcement is. And also just know that when positive reinforcement is being applied, what is the consequence of making a desired response? And that consequence isn't always negative. It could be the consequence is a reward, but the consequence is when a positive reinforcement is applied, that a pleasant experience begins, or their reward begins. That's what positive reinforcement is. So just a chart on, this is a schedule of reinforcement, talking about fixed ratios, variable ratios, whatever. Just a few things to know there. The only reason I kept this in there is to obtain the highest rate of correct responses from a subject, a researcher should use a fixed ratio schedule. That's the best of its perfect world, perfectly fixed. A subject will receive reinforcement only after giving a specific number of correct responses in a fixed ratio schedule. So both of those have to be met. So you should use a fixed ratio schedule, and you have to give that specific number of correct responses in that. Just be consistent is what that's saying. And the other thing is, what is the following benefit of using variable interval schedules of reinforcement? That's variable, so you're maybe not giving it every single time, but you're consistently, when you notice it, giving it. As long as they produce a steady response rate and high resistance to extinction, then variable is good. So, what is something that is got a high resistance, meaning it's not just going to be extinct because it's something maybe that happens more often than less, like eating, for instance. That's something that's happening a couple times a day, right? So if you're doing this, it's going to have a high resistance to extinction because it's something that's going to be done a lot. But if it's something that your dog you're going to give a treat after giving them a bath. Well, if you're only giving them a bath once every month or a couple of months, then you're not going to have as good of response rate, and it's a good chance that will be extinct after the first couple of times because it's not done enough. That frequency isn't enough. So just know what a token economy is, just a theory, because there are a couple of test questions that may be on that, or one. and they're based on the principle of like a applied behavior analysis, also ABA. You'll hear that in psychology a lot. It emphasizes the use of positive reinforcement to the targeted behavior change. So what a token economy, that's just known in psychology and this type of experimental type thing. And it kind of helps someone that's learning it, a student, let's say, understand, or even a therapist, if you're teaching someone this process, you're trying to teach them how they can self-reinforce to give themselves a reward or a way to visualize their progress so they can accept, the work in delayed reinforcement because they learn to self-monitor and they learn to regulate their own behavior. That's what a token economy just basically is. It's teaching someone to measure and reinforce their own behaviors. And that's when, if you know that you've got bad habits and you want to change a habit, and you want to make it a better habit, then you may have to take a more methodical approach and standardization so you can have this better response. So we'll go over that a little bit more at the end here in a moment. But which reward schedule is most productive and most resistant to extinction? And that is going to be your variable ratio. A varying number of correct responses must be made to get a reinforcement. I put that in there because I don't necessarily agree with the answer to this question because they did have fixed ratio in there. But the reason why it's most resistant to extinction, and it's the reason I didn't do it, I agree with the answer, but it is confusing and a lot of people get this one wrong, this question when they get it. It's most resistant to extinction because let's say that animal isn't expecting a treat every single time. It happens like every 2 out of 3 times. So because of that, since they're not expecting it every time, then that's going to be a more effective reward schedule. But if you're doing it every time where it's fixed, it's perfect, like in the experiment when it's perfect, when it stops, then they're not going to get the most effective response to that because they're immediately going to think, wow, I didn't get a treat. So, but if you do variable, then it's going to have a higher, it's more productive and more resistant to extinction. So observational learning, this is another part of learning, a different learning. We had associative learning and the different parts of associative. Now we're getting into observational learning. Of course, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's describing a process of learning by just watching others and retaining that information and then later replicating the behavior that you observed. You're learning from other people. It's also known as shaping and modeling as well. Observational learning, it's more common, of course, in children as they imitate behavior of their parents or adults. And on the test, I think there's a question about who are you most likely to observe and learn from when we talk about observational learning. And really one of those things, the answer is just someone who you admire. As an infant, of course, is someone that's feeding you, someone you trust. And as you're growing, it's the people you admire, of course, are your parents. But as you get older, it's more of the people that you're going to model or people that you respect, you admire, you want to be like them. That's who you're going to actually be more likely to learn from observing behavior. In observable behavior, there was a famous experiment back in the 1960s, Albert Bandura. They had this Bobo doll experiment. And the doll is about the same size as the person. And they did this experiment, this inflatable toy, and it's about the same size, of course, as a prepubescent, child, whatever. And they wanted to demonstrate that if the children were witness to aggressiveness, like they watched fighting, and they wanted, really what they were looking at is how do these cartoons that are being shown and these different, before social media, of course, back in the 60s, but television, when they see it, are they going to be more or less likely? Does this affect their behavior? And they actually did show that when they're watching this aggression on TV, or of course, if they see it at home as well, that they are more likely to repeat that. So they theorized and kind of demonstrated how that aggression really is at the root of many social illnesses, ranging from interpersonal violence and even war. So That theory too, with the Bandura's Bobo doll study, led to what's known as social learning theory. And it was also proposed by Albert Bandura, but it emphasized the importance of observing and modeling and imitating behaviors and even attitudes and emotional reactions. How is someone reacting? So if the child's watching sports and their favorite athlete is throwing a fit, and knocking over bottles and doing all that, they're going to be more likely to repeat that. And that's just kind of the fact. So they described, what he did was, when social learning theory, he described specific kind of steps in the process of modeling that have to be followed if learning is to be successful. Some of these you want to model great behavior. So we want to create a plan or a method that can be followed so we can train and teach kids to model the right behavior. And the steps are really attention. The first thing is to give it attention, retention of that information, reproduction of that behavior, and then the motivation is key behind it. So those like 4 different steps are specific and are essential in the process of modeling behavior if it's going to be successful. So again, it was attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. Those are the 4. So and again, social learning theory, it just considers how also the environment and cognitive factors. So we'll get into cognitive learning here in a minute, but cognitive factors, how we think, how we process information, how they're interacting to influence our human learning and, of course, our behavior. That's what social learning theory is, still very, very much used today. So observational learning, again, this isn't on the test, but something to kind of think about with social media. And you think about how important this is, and maybe something for a final project, but when we understand about social learning theory, that we're learning from repeating people that we admire. Well, in social media, and you realize that not everything you see on social media is true. And when we're repeating these behaviors and what we think people are like, how does that impact the way you are? Do you learn? Who do you admire? And, do you really know them as a person, what the struggles are, what they've gone through? And, here's the unfortunate part too, is there are a lot of people on social media that young people do admire, that really it's the struggle, and they talk about it on social media, and depression everywhere and suicide everywhere. And how does that impact people? I mean, you see young people where they're depressed. That's how they're mimicking behaviors of other people they admire. Because seriously, this is a research. It's statistically, at least shown that the research does show that most of those people that are in entertainment, for instance, that write books, that write movies, that are creative thinkers, they do songwriters, musicians, they do their best when they're in this depressive state. When all the walls are gone and they're at a lowest point, that's when this heartfelt, amazing music, amazing book, whatever, really comes about. And you learn about that, and you think that's really cool. But these people aren't always depressed. They're not always in this negative emotional state. That's just when they do their best work. But then you get younger people trying to mimic it. That's when it does kind of become a major problem, is you see them in that light and think to be like them, you have to go through that. And it's not true. So, it does mean that you can be very creative in those states, but it shouldn't encourage anyone to be sad or go through this depression to just be creative. There's a lot of different, in the media, they cover tragedies, they cover all these negative events, and you see it over and over and over. And that really does affect us. It has a very bad effect. That's why I say don't watch the news right before you go to bed. Don't look at social media a few hours before you go to bed. That media and violence can create, self-harm, aggression, disinhibition, desensitization. If you see it something over and over and over, and let's say you're shocked at someone being shot, the first time you see it, of course, it's very shocking. But if you saw it every single day, you're not as shocked. It just kind of wears off, that shock. And that's a problem. You should be shocked seeing that. And that's where that desensitization really comes into play and is very, very negative. So now we're getting into the cognitive learning. So, that's where we are really wanting to learn. We're forcibly trying to use a certain process so we can start really what we're doing with cognitive learning theory. We're thinking about thinking. And it can be influenced by like internal factors like how focused we are, how distracted we become, but also external factors like whether things, we're learning are valued by our community, our family, or whether, we're going to receive praise or, from others for doing what they want, and what we learn. So cognitive learning is a higher level learning involving thinking, knowing, understanding, anticipation. That's what cognitive learning is. And having a growth mindset. If you've ever heard of, growth mindset, that is integral to learning. And what growth mindset, it's defined, I put it on the screen there, as higher level learning involving thinking, knowing, understanding, and anticipation. That's cognitive. But the growth mindset is actually defined, I thought I had it on there, as a belief that it construes, intelligence as something that can be changed, something that can be influenced and improved upon, malleable. That's the word I'm looking for. So that is what that growth mindset is, to say, hey, I am who I am now, but I know I can be better. I know I can change. I know I can be smarter. I know I can, be an improvement of who I am today, because who I am today doesn't define who I am tomorrow. That's that growth mindset. Also realizing that intelligence, we talk about, the human brain, and you're looking at the elasticity of your brain and how it can grow as long as you're learning new things. And you can learn. And think about that video that started this. It said if your brain were, a computer, it could hold, and I think it said like 3 million hours of television shows. 3 million. That's crazy. That's what the capability is. And we use so little of our mind and our brain power that a growth mindset, meaning like if you didn't have a growth mindset, you may say, okay, I can't learn another language, or let's say math is hard. But because of that, if you don't have a growth mindset, you may not try math, or you may not have that open mind to it. But if you have a growth mindset and you realize you can learn it, then you would say math is hard, but I know that if I study, I will get better at it and I can learn it. That's the growth mindset. That's what's so important of everything else that we go through in psychology. Having that growth mindset, this is with positive psychology, newer psychology, saying that is going to influence you more than anything. So if you've been told you're not smart, you're not good at something, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's the problem. Having a growth mindset said, I know I could be better and I can change. So learning strategies, when we talk about how do you get a growth mindset, there's a couple of things. Space learning that's on there, metacognition, I think it was mentioned earlier in one of the slides, but like space learning it's all about beating the forgetting curve. By everyone is going to learn something. And even when I mentioned this in the video, you may understand it now. And so you have the capability to understand exactly what I'm saying with a growth mindset, for instance. But how long is it going to take before you forget what growth mindset means? So if it's something that you know is important, then what you have to do is what space learning means. You're going to go ahead and write it down and keep a notebook of very important things, and we use OneNote, of course, in class, but I use it for so many different things. So I can go back and find it. But if it's really important that you need to learn how you can relearn some of this stuff and go over it a few times, and after you have, then it becomes part of what's called crystallized intelligence, and you can recall it quickly. That's how you grow. That's how you learn more, and you're more likely to absorb and understand that new information. Where metacognition, it helps you become more effective learners, and that is more by goal setting, understanding how these strategies, and measuring or monitoring that progress, writing down your goals, reflecting on those outcomes, and then holding yourself accountable. That's kind of that metacognition, and that with space learning and these learning strategies kind of go hand in hand. I'm got to speed up, so I'm going too slow. But on this slide, just about Bloom's taxonomy, kind of talked about it. It's developed to provide a common language. So there are different things that we'll use as teachers, professors, teachers, educational psychologists, use these processes and have to have a systematic way to really teach someone and learn how this, the way that we teach these things to students, how it comes into play. And Bloom's taxonomy, basically, it's just a common language for teachers to use to discuss exchange learning techniques and assessment methods. That's really what it comes down to. And you have the learning outcome, and it just tells you how do you assess it, how do you teach, and it's just more of a systematic way and a different step process of how the knowledge, how recall and comprehension, application, analysis, all that is done, and evaluation, how that's done through the step-by-step process. And it was developed, and this may be on the test, why it was developed. It was basically for teachers to discuss and exchange learning and assessment methods. It's kind of why that was done. Types of instruction, just a couple of things, maybe on a test. Discovery instruction generally provides learners with the ability for active learning through exploration. That's what discovery, through exploring. Think of Discovery Channel, exploration. It's kind of the answer there. What are two characteristics of discovery learning? That's insight and understanding. You see that in discovery learning there on the second box. And then the third is when is feedback most effective in to facilitate learning? It's actually when it's detailed. It's also when it's immediate, but it needs to be, the feedback can be detailed. That becomes really necessary, especially in a work environment when you're trying to teach someone and you want to have that desired learning and ability, is not just saying you're right or wrong. You want to provide some feedback in that environment. So let's go on to 6, behavioral self-management. Now we're going to just finish up this as quickly as we can about behavioral self-management is a process of modeling your own behavior by systematically managing cues, cognitive processes, cognitive consequences. And of course, there's a behavior model, behavior self-management, I'm sorry. It's an approach to learning and behavioral change. It relies on, the individual relies on you to take initiative in controlling this change process. So there are some steps right there, but one model really that's called an ABC model. It's one of those. And realize what is a response change and how do you change unwanted behavior? The first step is to understand what a response change is. It usually means whenever I sit on the couch at night, I eat ice cream. Whenever I watch TV in bed, I smoke a cigarette. I don't know what it is. You think about this unwanted behavior, and you're going to create this model. It's ABC and they put it on here that the antecedent that you see as a step 1, they just want it to be ABC. Really, they would have really called it what it is, and that's really coming before is what that means. The prior thing, that's that trigger, that the cue. They would call it cue, but they already had a C, but it's antecedent. And then when that happens, if you have the antecedent or that cue of what is triggering this behavior, when I'm driving home from work, I stop and I get a beer, or school, whatever, and you want to stop drinking because it's causing a problem, then you recognize this chain, this, that's really important, this response chain, that when this happens, this is behavior, and then you focus on that consequence. Here's the negative consequence on why this has to change. That's what this ABC model is. And it's a technique to break this bad behavior. And the key is to identify what that antecedent is and what happens that triggers the behavior event. So there's covert sensitization, it's a form of behavior therapy where that someone would walk you through it, identify it, and then kind of have you visualize and mentally process these negative consequences to try to recognize these cues that are happening that lead to that negative behavior. So behavioral contract is just something that, if you have a bad habit you would like to change, it's just a contract with yourself, but it's formal. You write it down and say, this is what I would like to change. This is a contract with myself. And by understanding this process, some psychologists, they recommend, you create this and you identify these events, that ABC that I just mentioned to you, where you understand these cues, the behavior consequences, you write it down, and you start recording what ends up happening. And there's different, like 6 different steps of breaking a bad habit. And I didn't write it down here, but the 6 steps, the first thing is you identify what your goal is. What is that behavior goal? And then record a baseline on how often this is happening right now. This is what happens. Then you're going to give yourself a reinforcement, a reward. And you're going to say, if this happens, once I do this positive thing, remember, we respond better to positive than the negative. We don't want to pull a rubber band, the negative, because it's a lot of times what you do is repeated, whether it's positive or negative, is what really the truth is. So you want to reward yourself whenever you don't do that, and you do this when you go home, let's say to study or spend time with family, whatever the case may be. Here are some of those positive reinforcements. Then you start recording it. Then you start rewarding yourself. And then if it's not working, you just kind of adjust your plan. So those are kind of like six steps of like breaking a bad habit. I think they were discussed more in the book, but that's what that behavior contract would be. So what are 3 of the 6 steps of changing a bad habit? So look at those, and it's only 3 of 6, and that answer is going to be D, because here are the 6 different steps that I mentioned to changing a bad habit. And that was mentioned in D. What must be paired together for classical conditioning to occur? Do you remember that? So for it to occur, so it means it hadn't occurred. That should be a trigger right there. Classical conditioning, it has not been occurred, so nothing is conditioned. If anything says conditioned, it's wrong. We have conditioned here, or no, we have conditioned here, conditioned here. It can't be that. And then this is an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Is it really that? Or is it a neutral? It's neutral stimulus and an unconditional response. If those two are paired, that's when classical conditioning would take place. So that wraps it up. I went a little over, but thank you so much for your time. And next class, we're going to talk about chapter 7, memory. Very, very interesting when we get into that. But that does it for now. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.